In 1973, Craig VanGrasstek was only 14. He was playing a Lewis Fallett's game called Dungeon. Now, Lewis Fallett had experienced Dungeons and Dragons before it had been published, and this was a sort of broken telephone version of that game before you could pick it up off the shelf. What Craig VanGrasstek decided to do in 1974 was write up the rules of the game that he and his friends had been playing. Now, these rules are only a few pages long, but what makes them really interesting and exciting is that they were effectively the first variant of Dungeons and Dragons, and this is according to Jon Peterson, historian of the era. So people like Craig and Lewis were playing role-playing games before role-playing games were actually even published, and they were already changing them from the first version they'd experienced. I spoke to Craig to learn a little more about why he played. So Craig, really good to speak to you again. I really appreciate your time. What I wanted to first bring up is, in effect, who you are and your relationship to, if I may call it, the prehistory of role-playing games, because you
Yeah.
straddled the prehistory and then the immediate impact of D&D when it was released in January 1974, where you intersect in this particular story. Can you tell us that?
All right. Well, you do ask the broader question of, how significant was this? As an historian myself, taking a step back and looking, I think that it was more of an anomaly and maybe an outlier. The experience that I had, it was more personal and a small circle of friends, but it's nonetheless one that Jon Peterson and others have taken note of as being the first time that a certain sequence of events occurred. Last time we spoke, I tried to explain how I thought this fit within sort of a Venn diagram of different parts of geek culture. And thinking about it, I decided that the best way to present this story would be, in fact, to make the Venn diagram. When I was around 9 or 10 years old, I started reading comic books in a very serious way. And by serious, I mean I I was paying attention initially to the artwork, to the stories. But from the time I was around 9 or 10 years old, I was reading comic books very seriously. And I was also very interested in the social phenomenon. But this was during a period when we didn't have the internet, we didn't have social media. If you had an interest that was not the usual range of interests of your immediate circle of friends, there was really no way to come in contact with other people. So I couldn't go online and ask who else is interested in comic books. Uh, so for a number of years, I was paying attention to these issues solely on my own. But sometime around 1972, there was an article in the local paper about other people who collected comic books and how they were associated with a science fiction group. So there was the Minnesota Science Fiction Society, or MinSTEF, which still exists to this day. I have not been at a MinSTEF meeting since, I don't know, 1980 or so. I know that it was founded in 1966. I knew the founders because I joined when I was about 12, around 1972. And a lot of the people who were interested in science fiction, a subset of them anyway, were also interested in comic books. But it's through them that I began then reading classic science fiction, Bradbury, Clark, Asimov, etc. It was in that group that then I began to be aware of the other parts of what we come to think of as fandom, or different parts of geek culture. And one of those groups was the war gamers. Now, you had almost no overlap between the comic book people and the wargaming people. The wargaming people, however, there's a fair amount of overlap with the science fiction people. And there was something in Minneapolis called the Little Tin Soldier Shop. It used to be called LaBelle Alliance. And it was at that time a very unusual thing, although today, any city of notable size that you go to, you can find some sort of gaming shop. In those days, this was very unusual to find, but we had it. And there were people there who engaged in war games, either of the type that you do on octagonal boards with little cardboard cutouts, or they were doing it with figurines and playing everything from Napoleonic or earlier war games through speculative science fiction type of games. There's another side story to that that I won't go into here because it involves a different set of people, but that's the model railroaders. And the Little Tin Soldier Shop was right next to the model railroading shop in those days. And I was one of the people who was really fascinated in the making of figurines and the making of dioramas. And I really enjoyed all that detail work and painting and shading. And that it was in that context that I came to know some of the people who were also involved in war games, like Michael Mornard, who plays a role in the history of Dungeons and Dragons. There was also Professor Mar Barker, a philologist, who was very critical in the development of science fiction or fantasy games. I knew him only in the context that I painted figurines for him. He hired me out as a teenager to do that because that's what I enjoyed doing. But it's in this context of going to the regular every 2 week meetings of MinStuff, the Minnesota Science Fiction Society, and the wargaming that we did within those meetings, which is everything from standard board games like Risk to the more serious war games. Someone one day, well, that someone, Blue Petal, was the name he went by. His actual name was Lewis Fallard. Showed up, I guess this was early 1974, and he said, "I've just played this really interesting game. It's called Dungeon. We should play it." He didn't say Dungeons and Dragons. He had been at some meeting, I think, at the Kauffman Memorial Hall at the University of Minnesota, where I was not yet a student, although I would be a few years later. And he was at a game where they played what he called Dungeon. He said that we could play it there at one of these MinStuff meetings. And even though I don't remember precisely when this was, I have a very vivid memory of that particular meeting. I know that it was held at the home of Denny Lean, who was one of the people who most frequently hosted MinStuff meetings. And it was a game that we understood could be played as long as you had paper and pencil and some dice. And in those days, the only dice that people played with were the six-sided dice, and no one knew anything about 20-sided or percentile die or any of that sort of thing. Anyway, we played that game, and I was hooked, and a number of us were hooked on what we understood to be kind of make up the rules as you go along type of game, which seemed very simple, didn't have printed rules, and it was only later that it occurred to me that we ought to have printed rules in the case that there was any dispute over how you played a certain thing or what was the number of points associated with this thing or that. And it was in that context that eventually I wrote up the rules as I understood them, and we played by those rules. A number of us would play these games at MinStuff meetings, and we started playing them outside of MinStuff meetings. And this is something that at the age of 15 or so, I would get together with two or three other friends, and we might start playing in the evening, and we'd be playing until 5 or 6 in the morning. And this was all before another group of people showed up, and that was the SCA people, the Society for Creative Anachronism. And again shows up Michael Mornard, who was very important in establishing the local chapter in Minneapolis. And I was just checking last night and trying to figure out if anyone has attached a date to when this happened, and I couldn't find it. I do know that SCA was first established in 1966, which coincidentally is when MinStuff was established, but was not established in Minneapolis until some years later. I'm going to say about 1974 or 75. I was actually at the founding meeting, which was held at that very same Kauffman Memorial Hall at the University of Minnesota, and Michael Mornard was there and others. And I had already known these people from having played war games with them, and they established the local chapter. So Michael is a person who has his feet in a lot of these circles, but not in the dungeon circle. He didn't play dungeon, he played D&D. And I need to stress throughout when I say that as an historian, looking back on it objectively, I'd say that we were a small group. I would say a hard core of maybe half a dozen. And I don't know if the rules that I wrote up, although I made them with the intention of distributing them at the World Science Fiction Convention in Washington that year, I don't know if anyone outside of our circle ever used them, ever played with them. And they certainly were not used by the people who played the established D&D. The established D&D players was a much larger circle, and of course, they weren't just in Minneapolis. They were spread out from Wisconsin, where the game began and where Michael Mornard came from, and they became the dominant faction. And I would say the dungeon as we played was basically 1974, 1975, and then the story ends. And the story ends because I discovered something that was more interesting to me, which was young women. And that became a focus of such time as I had for socializing was no longer going to be spent with other young men from 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning rolling dice and fighting trolls, but rather um, in more romantic pursuits. And that's basically the end of that story for me.
Do you remember why you felt that that particular kind of game was different enough or better than the other games that made you? Because it sounds like you felt quite strongly about this game. You enjoyed it more than the others. Is that fair to say? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is that fair to say?
I think, and I'm just remembering off the top of my head here, but I think what really appealed to me was the idea of becoming the dungeon master and expressing my own creativity in that way and creating the different rooms and challenges and so forth. It was more the creativity than the playing of the game that
Right.
appealed to me. The D&D people are very serious in our view. And I came to think of them as being sort of careerists on behalf of their characters. So I did play D&D with Michael and others in subsequent years because later, after 1975, 75, 76, 77, Michael lived in a group home with people in Minneapolis, and that's where I would spend my weekends. And they gave me the use of a room, and it was very kind of them. And that's where I hung out. I would sometimes play D&D with them, but I wasn't really all that interested in it because, to my mind, they were very serious about the game, and we always played Dungeon as an extended joke. And it was all about setting up humorous encounters and coming up with humorous ways of getting out of them. It was basically the anticipation of creating the joke that was more interesting to me, and also then playing out the joke than in the challenge of a game in which you were trying to establish and build the record and achievements of your persona. At that time, no one thought it odd that you would have people from the ages of 12 to Mar Barker would be in his 50s by that time, that we would all play together. Um, and there was generally a thing about fandom or nerd culture of acceptance. And the fact that someone was very young was not viewed as a barrier to their participation. And I certainly appreciated it at that time. There was also the sense that most of us, one way or another, lived in the land of misfit toys. And as misfits, we kind of belonged together. In my own background, I will say quite literally, I have never seen a football game in my life. And by football, I mean either what we call soccer or or what we call football. I don't know how the game is played. It's never interested me, but other things have interested me. So in my whole life, there are things that most people consider very normal that have not appealed to me. There are other things that appeal to me that are outside of what is most expected to be of interest to people of whatever my age group has been.
The thing that gets me is that you were the 14, you were presumably the youngest in the group, and it was you who decided to write the rules up.
Yes.
Why do you think it was you who did that and not one of the other people, especially given your age?
Yeah, I think a fair amount of it has to do with my upbringing. My mother was an information scientist. When that term was just being developed, because people would have said librarian. To this day, if you want to find the early things that people were writing about computer-based searches, something that she wrote around this time called My Library as a Computer Terminal. Um, she worked in a scientific research facility, and she was the person who was responsible for hooking up people with their professional journals and so forth. I always had a very orderly view of things. I worked for her in her library, and making sense of things has always made sense to me. So putting things in order has always appealed to me. And the idea of playing a game without written rules uh, seemed wrong somehow. Also, at the same time, there was the notion that if I wrote the rules, this would get me sort of social credit with the bunch, and it would be a way of showing that, I had a certain maturity or sophistication, although I wouldn't necessarily think of it in precisely those terms at that time. But it was a desire to put order in something that, all right, it's fine that it had a certain amount of flexibility, but flexibility is one thing and chaos is another. And I guess it's that same impulse that makes me an historian today and makes me want to write books explaining how we get to where we are today through an historical process. So there's a certain continuity there, mentally speaking.
I think there's maybe a distinction between players of role-playing games and dungeon masters and probably again designers, in that the dungeon masters in particular and the designers in particular as well, but probably not the players, are much more interested in taking the world apart and putting it back together again and reverse engineering things and
Yeah.
understanding the probability curves of things. Why does this happen? In a sense, to kind of impose a bit of order on reality through fantasy. Now, I don't want to impose all that upon you, but that sounds, I'm quite happy that what you've said so far is reasonably consistent with that thesis.
I would say that actually my first exposure here, just reaching on in my bookshelf, here's my modern elementaries. It probably doesn't show up because it's all green, but my modern elementary statistics text from the time I was an undergraduate, the fact that I have it easily at hand here, I have to deal with statistics all the time, should tell you something about how important statistics are. My first exposure to probability theory was sitting down with a pair of dice and making a 2 by 2 table and figuring out what is the percentage chance that a certain number will show up, given the fact that there's only one way in a pair of dice to get two and one way in a pair of dice to get 12, but there are multiple ways to get every number between them. And I well remember working all those things out and thinking, wow, this makes sense. And I was never interested in math class. I wasn't that good at math, but the idea of working out for myself the statistical probability of an event and then applying that to this fantasy world and saying, well, if I want there to be a 1 in 4 chance that someone can survive a particular type of encounter, what are the numbers on the dice that they need to be able to produce? And I can look at that and see on my table and figure out, you know, what are the places where there's a 75% chance that it falls within a field versus the 25% chance that it's outside the field. To me, that was very appealing.
For yourself and the people around you, how niche slash unusual do you think you were looking back relative to whatever you think the societal norm was at the time?
Well, I mean, certainly in the junior high school and high school I was in, there was no one else who was interested in the same things. Uh, when you got to the college level, and I was at a university, and there were, tens of thousands of students, then you can find people and they'll form clubs and that sort of thing. But I do think there's an interesting story that has been told of the people who've looked at the history of the development of science fiction fandom, how it began through the letters columns of the science fiction magazines in, I think, the 1930s and into the 1940s. Uh, and these people got to know one another by writing letters, sort of bouncing off the satellite that is the magazine, and eventually they got together and formed meetings. I think they initially held conventions before they had regular meetings. Some of those people who began as fans became the real golden age science fiction authors themselves. And so there is a real value in that kind of social exchange. Uh, there's always some way to find out who else is out there. In my case, as I say, there was an article published in the newspaper about this fellow. Can you believe it? He's actually collecting comic books. But seeing that, actually, I didn't see the article. My mother saw the article. She brought it to my attention. We found those people, and they were in this MinStuff group, and that's how I ended up with them. However, in the absence of a reporter writing that article, in the absence of my seeing that, I probably eventually would have been aware that by that time there were science fiction and comic book conventions, but it may have been another couple of years before I made that discovery myself. So there are ways of finding it out, but it's not like having a search engine. I do understand that the human need for social interaction tends to be higher in some periods of life than in others. And although in these days I tend to be somewhat asocial and a recluse, and I do a lot of work on my own writing histories, when I was a teenager, I needed social interaction much more than I feel I need today. And so these were my friends. And yeah, I had friends in high school, I had friends in junior high school, but they weren't close friends. I didn't really spend a lot of time with them. My friends were the people that I went downtown to meet from the time I was 12 to, well, 12 to 15 for these groups. And then beyond 15, it was really, again, romantic attachments. But that was the social life that I had that I felt a need for. That it's less of a need for me today because, as I say, a lot of what I do in writing is a very solitary activity. I'm happy doing that. I'm happy doing my research, happy writing my books, and then such interaction as I have with a lot of other people more often will take the form of teaching classes. I enjoy that. But at that time, I had that need much more, and I think that that's sort of normal to the different stages of people's lives.
If you were to weigh up the relative importance of the social interaction versus what you've mentioned about the desire to run games and taxonomize and create rules, how would you evaluate the relative weights of those in terms of your motivation in playing these games at the time?
I'd say they're more qualitatively different than quantitatively different. They're not mutually exclusive. So it's not that doing one of them precludes doing the other. It's more like they blended together in my mind.
The early experience that you had back then, how do you think it's influenced the person that you became and are today?
I would say that playing games and interacting in that way has sort of sporadically been a part of what I do. So after this period of about 1972 to 1975, where there was a lot of game playing, I didn't really do a lot of it as an undergraduate. A couple of times I came in contact with, when I was an undergraduate with again these gamers and would sometimes play D&D or other games with them. But I remember, for instance, just randomly running into some of these people on a weekend once, and they were playing some role-playing game that took place in the Old West. And again, this is Michael Mornard and his circle, and I would play that game, but it just didn't have the same appeal to me as it did to them or as it had to me earlier. So it just was not all that important or interesting to me. When I was a graduate student, several of us enjoyed playing war games, although I wasn't as intensively interested in it as my immediate friends. There was a brief period in the mid to late 80s where I was thinking, it'd be very interesting is to put to good use my understanding of international relations now that I have my master's degree in foreign service. Maybe I could go out to California and make games about international relations. And I played around with that idea for a while and then dropped it, in part because I ended up being successful in what I was doing, which was in the field of trade policy. And why take up some risky different thing when I was already achieving success in the field that I had. So fast forward to, it's not until the 2000s that I returned to games. And I began teaching in the Harvard Kennedy School in the year 2000. I taught in the degree program that year. And then the next year, 2001, from 2001 to 2022, working with Robert Lawrence, who's an economist, we taught every year an executive education course that was for professionals in trade policy. And he was teaching the economics, and I was teaching the politics. But we were trying to, among other things, teach people how to be good negotiators. And negotiation skill is largely a question of practice. And so I think from the very first year, yes, in 2001, although it was a very crude version and it was really not very well developed, and it took me another year or two to make a good version of it, uh, we began making a negotiating game. And it was a tariff negotiating game. And of course, it was very quantifiable. And as such, that was actually the introduction I had to Excel. I had never used Excel before, but we needed a way to quantify people's results. And it was through that that initially I made these rather simple tariff negotiating games. Over time, developed into more sophisticated games involving tariff and non-tariff measures that ultimately I really perfected as a result of Brexit. Because what happened with Brexit was you suddenly had a bunch of Brits who needed to learn how to do the things that Brits were very good at doing that they'd completely forgotten to do over the course of a generation because you had outsourced the making of trade policy to Brussels. This role-playing game ultimately became, in the last few years that we were doing the Harvard course, the thing that many people identified at the end of that course as the most useful element in the course.
Again, it's been really, really interesting to talk to you. I thank you for your time. And yeah, hope to hear from you again soon.
Pleasure to be with you.